I've been to visit with what they call in England, euphemistically, Rule 45 prisoners. They are the segregated sex offenders in the wings of jails, I know in England, and I know in America as well, probably all over the world. They are amongst the most broken of human beings. I can tell you, as I stand here, that that haunted look in the eyes of those child murderers and convicted paedophiles that I saw in that prison wing cannot be reproduced by any human revenge or accusation. It was a vision of hell on earth. Raging against them would not have provided any justice. Revenge or use except to diminish us, who would increase the world's burden of pain by seeking to increase the hell that they were already in. Those whose crimes cry out, like in Genesis, cry to heaven for vengeance, are horribly aware of their own brokenness. And if they're not aware of it, then are they culpable? There is a great body of hard-won wisdom on this particular subject. It's not by accident that Jesus, that the great founders of the faith, that the women and the men who have been called saints, and the people who we would seek to learn from, even to the present day, have come back again and again and again to this question of judgment. Because it stands between us and God. Again and again it stands between us and God. These are men and women who thought long and prayed hard and won that wisdom after lifetimes of contemplation. Last week I preached on the dark night of the soul, self-discovery as a means of spiritual awakening and growth. Now, I sometimes feel that this particular person is here with us in this church, but David, my friend, young friend in North London from my first church, who I had this continual back and forth conversation with across the internet about all manner of religious matters, now watches our sermons every week when Francis puts them up on YouTube, and he is always coming back with comment about it. Usually I have to say positive comment, but it does mean to say that, we have conversations with people across the world about what goes on in this church. There are a family of thousands, literally actually now tens of thousands of people who follow the doings of us as a church family from all over the world. And David came to me, and he said that he'd been at a Benedictine abbey, Downside Abbey, recently. And Father Hugo, one of the old and revered monks there, said to him, in reference to the subject of my son, that you can't give yourself to God until you know what you're giving. You cannot give yourself to God until you know what you're giving. Well, if in the process of discovering what we've got to give to God, we do not come to realize enough about ourselves to feel fear and trembling at the thought of accusing another, of being the stumbling block in another's journey, then we can be sure that we don't know ourselves. I'm not accusing you all of being beasts and beings. Not at all. Not at all. I'm accusing you of what I accuse myself of, being human beings, which is a blessed and a glorious thing, but it also has consequences, because human beings make choices. And frequently along the way, we make very poor choices indeed. Now, we are forgiven and redeemed for those choices. I know we are. But if we forget what we are, if we forget what we could have been, if we forget the path that we may have gone, if somebody hadn't given us a hand, if we hadn't had a good education, if our parents hadn't have loved us, if we hadn't have been born into privilege, if any number of 100 possible variables hadn't have happened, then our spiritual journey becomes a walk through molasses. It becomes so much heavier a burden than the concept of the rich man in the eye of a needle. We become actively a danger to other people's journey by speaking from what we do not know. When we talk of ourselves and our own fallenness and our own brokenness, that is something we do know. What does Jesus say in this scripture reading? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Well, Jesus doesn't say, remove the log so that you can point at the speck in your brother's eye. Jesus does not say, take out the log in your own eye so that you will be perfectly justified in holding up your neighbor to ridicule and telling him how wicked he is. Jesus says, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. Jesus calls us to become self-aware, humble, and whole enough that we may work to heal one another, to help remove the speck in our neighbor's eye. But we can't become such a spiritual physician until we have attained enough wisdom to know when to shut up, enough wisdom to know when to speak, and enough wisdom to know how to bring someone else to healing and not to condemnation. Because it may make us feel better when we condemn someone else. But if it does not, in any jot or tittle, decrease the burden of misery in this world, then it's not what we're called to do. I pray again and again, more and more as time goes by, for tears of self-awareness, tears that I may remain able to feel pity and kindness to others, if I do feel such a thing. And it's a poverty-stricken life I lead in the way I look at it, in my ability. It takes something of such immensity to punch through that wall of indifference which we as human beings put up, that I am ashamed of myself. Yesterday morning I went along to Belle Reeve, and I can tell you the story of Alvaro because it's not a private story, and it's something which he would tell you himself, but he can't tell you himself. Alvaro had been homeless for 40 years. Alvaro came to Belle Reeve very sick, but with the hope and the expectation of the staff there that he may recover. But he was rushed to a hospital the day before yesterday, and then he was sent home to Belle Reeve to die. And although yesterday was quite a busy day for us, and it was a glorious, and it was a joyful, and it was a wonderful day. So we baptized 3 people, and we had about 40 people in our home, Leon's home. And it was a joyful day, it was a wonderful day. But I could not get away from the image of Alvaro in that bed. If anyone represented these who are the least of my children, it was him. And that's not because I believe he is the least, but because if it took Alvaro for me to respond as I should respond in empathy to everybody's situation, I am deeply and profoundly worried about how indifferent I have become. And I also am deeply and profoundly worried at the corporate sin that allows me to live happily in my home with all my comforts and know that there are millions of people with no home, with no health care, with no food, and frequently with no hope.